Hello, third grade, and welcome to our lesson for April 30th. We are starting to read the story called Phillis Wheatley, Slave Girl of Old Boston. This is found on pages 240 through 253. I hope that you will enjoy this story as we begin it together. Before we get started with reading, before you open your book, let's look at the words that are in today's lesson. Today's a little bit different. We have a list of words. Let's go ahead and say them together. Or I'll say them and you can repeat the word, okay? Amusement, astonishment, carriage, classics, despised, repealed. Now let's see which words you already know by me reading you some words that are synonyms of some of these words or a little bit of a definition. So do you remember what a synonym is? Two words that have about the same meaning. Can you remember an example of a synonym, a pair of words that are synonyms? Tiny, small, large, huge. Those are some examples. All right, I'm going to read through the list of words that you'll be able to choose from that will match these words. Withdrew, a vehicle with four wheels pulled by a horse. Enjoyment, scorned, of ancient Greece and Rome, amazement. All right, so now I'm going to say them individually, and you tell me which word would match this word. Ready? Scorned. Which word do you think means scorned? If you guessed despised, you are right. Scorned or despised means somebody's looking down on them, somebody almost like having a hatred towards somebody. Next word, amazement. Amazement. It's a synonym of astonishment. When you look at something with amazement or astonishment, amazement helps you understand that. You're just amazed, you're astonished, you can't believe it. Of ancient Greece and Rome. Which one of these words do you think means of ancient Greece and Rome? Classics. Classics, that's a name given to literature or stories that were written that you may read today that were written by those in ancient Rome and ancient Greece. Some people go to college and get a degree studying ancient Greece and ancient Rome, studying the classics. Next, withdrew. Repealed. To repeal something means to withdraw it, to take it away. Can you remember something from history that was repealed? Well, we're going to talk about it again in this lesson. And last one, enjoyment. Enjoyment. Amusement. Enjoyment and amusement mean the same thing. I'm sure when we get to go back to Wild Adventures, we'll be filled with amusement and enjoyment. Great, good job. Go ahead and open up your book now at this time to page 240. I'm going to change my background to what we're going to be talking about today. Go ahead and open up to page 240. I'm going to swing this way. This is what you see on page 240. I'm going to go ahead and read the top of that page. Character biographies. Asking the questions who, what, where, and when will help you find important information in a biography. So surprise, today is today's story and tomorrow's story, it's going to be part 1 and part 2, is a biography. Now let's look at the graphic organizer. This is a pretty cool graphic organizer, right? It has a picture of a young lady in the middle. And you know, in the middle of a graphic organizer like this, like a bubble chart or a bubble map, you have the main idea in the middle. Well, we have to figure out what the main idea is. And the main idea of this story, to figure it out, we're going to ask the questions that are on the graphic organizer. Go ahead and pause the video and read those questions to yourself. Now, why are question words such as who, what, when, that was where, and when, who, what, when, and where, why are these questions important for us to ask when we are reading a biography? Very important because it's going to help us look for information to find out what the story is all about. What does the author want us to know about this person? Now, what kind of story is Phillis Wheatley, Slave Girl of Old Boston? You've guessed right, it is a biography. Let's look at page 241. Phillis Wheatley, Slave Girl of Old Boston. Biography by Steffi Adams, illustrated by Sandy Mijas. Illustrated, that means that Sally Mijas is the illustrator. That person, Sally, she drew the pictures in this story, the illustrator, just like you have been illustrating pictures in your journal. So what is a biography? Do you remember the definition for biography? What is a biography? It's a true story about the life of a real person, and it's written by somebody else. That person didn't write it themselves. So somebody else has written a story about a real person, and the story, the biography, tells us what the person did in their life and what they experienced. Now, I'm going to go ahead and read the paragraph that's on page 241, a little background on Phillis Wheatley. In the summer of 1761, Susanna Wheatley was looking for a new slave to train to be her companion. On the slave block of Boston, she found a small 7-year-old girl. The child was dressed only in the tattered remnants of a carpet. She was sick too, possibly as the result of a long ocean voyage on the slave ship. Other slave buyers passed her over because of her condition, but Mrs. Wheatley saw something she liked in the child's face. Having paid the slaver's price, she took the child to the Wheatley home on King Street and put her to bed. So we have a child who was sold into slavery. I want us to take a look at this map so that you can remember from history what we are talking about here. We learned in history that on the continent of Africa that people were sold into slavery. Many people were kidnapped and stolen and sold there on the coast and taken to the coast to board a ship and to travel. Well, I don't know if you would call it traveling, but they would be imprisoned on a ship, held captive. I'm going to take me off of there. Held captive and taken from Africa all the way over to North America. And if you look at the arrow that goes from Africa over to North America, the West Indies, it says enslaved persons. So people were trading gold, pepper, and enslaved persons and bringing them to the West, to North America. And at that time, some people who were enslaved were forced to stay on the islands there in the West Indies and work, and others were boarded back on a ship to take to the British colonies. And that is the period of time that we are talking about today, are the British colonies. And now we're going to take a look at this picture right here. So where did it say that this girl was sold on a slave block? Boston. So here you have the northeast United States, and here's Massachusetts. Boston is right there in Massachusetts. So she traveled from Africa on a slave ship all the way over to North America, and she was taken to Boston, and that is where she was sold to a lady named Mrs. Wheatley. What year was that? What year was that? 1761. So let's go ahead and take a look back at your page 240. At this time, I want you to pause the video. If you do not have this paper with you yet, I want you to pause the video and go and get it, because there's some things that you can fill in already. I want you to fill in this worksheet as we read through these next 2 days. We have some questions here. Who is this story about? The question on the graphic organizer might be a little bit confusing. It says who they are. We're only talking about one person, the young lady in the middle of the graphic organizer. The questions on the graphic organizer are talking about anytime we read a biography, these are the questions we would ask. So who is she? You would write her name. What's her name? Phillis Wheatley. You can write her name in there. And as you read, as you learn information about her, you could write it on there. You could write that she was enslaved. What other question? When did this take place? So far we can see that in 1771 or 1761, we don't know how old she was yet, but you're going to find out in the story. So 1771, this is also during the time of slavery in the United States. Actually, 1771, was it the United States yet? No, it was colonial America. Where? Do we know where yet? Where they lived? And it's actually she. Where did Phillis Wheatley live? You could write born in Africa. And then where was she taken to? To Boston. So you have information that you could pause and write down already. What's that last question? What she did. What she did. So as we read today, you're going to keep asking yourselves these questions that are on the graphic organizer. Have that handy for you, okay? And so as we're reading, we want to ask ourselves, who was Phillis Wheatley? Why is Phillis Wheatley important? Where it says what they did, that is talking about important information. Why are we learning about Phillis Wheatley? There's something very special and important about her life and things that she did. Okay, at this time, I want you to go ahead and pause the video, and I want you to read pages 242 through 244 silently, and then come back on for some comprehension questions. As you read, don't forget to ask yourself who, what, where, and when. All right, good job. So on page 242, I have a where question for you. Where did the little slave girl have to rest when she first got to the Wheatley house? Remember what we were told before you started reading? She was very sick when Mrs. Wheatley bought her. Isn't that terrible to think about, that she bought another person? This is a sad part of history for us to read about and learn about, but we need to know our history, remember? So it will never happen again. Where did she have to rest in her home? In the home. Right, in the sick room. Very good. Who, on page 242, who entered the room quietly? Who was that? Mary. Mary entered the room quietly. So when did Phillis begin to speak English and take reading lessons? Remember, she was kidnapped, stolen from her homeland, and forced into slavery. So she spoke a completely different language, and she had to learn English. So when did she begin to speak English and take reading lessons? Well, after she got well. She was in that sick room and she was very sick for a long time. Once she got well, she began to start to learn English and learn how to read. Let's look at page 243. Can you think of any questions to ask about this page that start with what? I have a question. What did Mrs. Wheatley find Phillis doing one day? On page 243. And you can look at the illustration as well. That's right. She saw her trying to write on the wall with a piece of charcoal. Is that how you write? You write on your wall? No. What do you have? Pens and pencils. So then, what did Mrs. Wheatley ask Mary to get for Phillis? That's right. She asked her to get her a paper and pen so that she could write. Who taught her how to write? Mrs. Wheatley and Mary. Very good. Now know that in early colonial American time, that many people learned at home, right? A lot of the people that we learned about on our wall at school were taught at home. And then one-room schoolrooms were built and children were able to go to school, but there were many people who weren't allowed to go to school. Remember learning about that. And certainly Phillis Wheatley would not have been allowed to go to school. Okay, go ahead and turn to page 244. 244. Do you have any questions that you could ask on this page that begin with what? I have one. What did Phyllis study when she was 12? 12 years old, what did she study? Latin and the classics, the vocabulary word, remember? Classics. Those are the works of ancient Greece and Rome, literature, stories written from ancient Greece and Rome. What did Phyllis learn to write? Poems. She loved to write poems. What was repealed during the year that Phyllis turned 12? Very important for you to know this. This is a real story about a real person named Phillis Wheatley. What was repealed? Remember, repealed means to withdraw, to take away. The Stamp Act, that's right, the Stamp Act. Do you remember learning about that in history? The colonists were very upset with England for having the Stamp Act. Part of the anger going towards and causing colonists to decide to get out from underneath the British rule eventually. Okay, very good. Oh, one more question for you. Can you think of a question that would start with where? Where did Mary and Phyllis put candles? In all the windows. Good. Okay, at this time, go ahead and pause the video. Read pages 245 and 246. Make sure you're looking at your graphic organizer to ask yourself, where did they live? Who? We already know, Phyllis Wheatley. When? Oh, could you write something else on when? That's right. When? During the Stamp Act time. That's right. Also, I'm thinking during the colonial times. That's something else that you might want to write there. What they did? Have you heard anything so far? Something important about Phyllis? Well, let's keep reading. Go ahead and pause the video and come back on for some more questions. Okay, good job. 245. Can you think of any questions that begin with where for this page? Where was the Wheatley family going? To the Boston Common, to the Boston Common. Remember that this whole story that we're reading so far is taking place in Boston, Massachusetts, in the Northeast. And this was during colonial times before states gained their independence from Britain or England. Very good. Okay, let me go back to our graphic organizer so we can keep thinking about our questions. All right, let's see, what about a who? Can you think of a question to ask if we were in class? A question that starts with who? Who rode in the family carriage to the Boston Common? Who rode in the carriage? I'm going to show you a picture of the carriage. 4 wheels pulled by a horse. Who rode in that carriage? The Wheatley family and Phyllis. The Wheatley family and Phyllis. I'm thinking that they're being kind to Phyllis, a lot kinder than we hear of other people who were enslaved the way that they were treated. The people who bought her are teaching her how to read, allowing her to ride in the carriage with her, which is something that we should do today, always when we have guests in our home. But remember that she was not a guest. She was bought as a slave. Okay, very good. What about why? Can you think of a question why? I don't have that written on a card, but why? Why do you think the large crowd was gathering for this event? They went to the Boston Common. Why do you think this whole group of people were all gathered together? Right? Because the repeal, the withdrawal of the Stamp Act was very important. Colonists were very upset that they were having to pay this unfair money to the British. Good. So then what? What did Phyllis decide to write? She decided to write a poem to who? Remember, pause the video if you can so that you can find the answer. What did she write? A poem to King George. Very good. Okay, let's look at the last page there, page 246. So she's at the Boston Commons with a whole group of people celebrating the repeal of the Stamp Act. You know what? I'm thinking that our graphic organizer, when I ask myself, when did this take place? I would add that to my graphic organizer. the repeal of the Stamp Act. That's an important part of history, the time that this took place. Good to know. So when did Phillis begin to write a poem to King George? Well, as soon as she got home, she started to write her poem. In her poem, what did she thank King George for? For repealing the Stamp Act. So here she was, really a young girl, writing a letter, a poem to the king to thank him. So then what did Mrs. Wheatley encourage her to do? To write more poems. That's right. Very good. What did Phillis like to write about? She liked to write about what was happening in the city and what was happening at home. Very good. Oh, who narrowly escaped from an accident at sea? And there on page 246, can you find the answer to that question? Who narrowly escaped from an accident at sea? Do you know what narrowly escaped means? Well, narrow means really tiny little space. So it means barely escaping danger or trouble. So they escaped, but they barely escaped. All right, so why do you think that Phillis is concerned about these two men? Why is she concerned about these two men? Right, she's thinking about what would have happened to them if they had died, which is what a lot of people think about when people die or they almost die. She's thinking about eternity, whether they would have gone to heaven or would they have gone to hell? So then what did Phillis begin to write then? Yes, she began to write about eternity, about heaven and hell, and about these two men. So she wrote that poem. What happened to her poem? Very good. It was published in the Rhode Island newspaper. How amazing. Very good. And how old was she when it was published in the Rhode Island newspaper? She was 13 years old. Very good. She was 13 years old. Okay, at this time, I'm going to ask you just a couple review questions before we end. Looking at our graphic organizer, who was Phillis Wheatley? Who was she? Things that you could answer and put in there. A slave girl or a girl who was enslaved, and she belonged to the Wheatley family. When and where did she live? Well, she was born in Africa, and then in 1761, she was sold as a slave in Boston, Massachusetts. Okay. What other factors do you know about Phillis Wheatley so far? Well, she was sick when Mrs. Wheatley bought her. Mrs. Wheatley cared for her until she got well. And these are things that you wouldn't write on the graphic organizer, okay? For what they did, we're waiting to find out the most important thing that she did in her life, okay? Phillis learned to read and write, right? She especially loved to write what? Poems. She wrote a poem to who? What famous person? King George. And then she wrote about two men who narrowly escaped from an accident at sea. Good job. That is it for our lesson today. I do want to show you something. I want you to remember that the person that we are talking about today is a real person. A real person. And if you were to go to Boston, you would see this monument that is there. Phillis Wheatley. This is a monument, a sculpture made of her. We are reading a biography about a real person, the real life of Phillis Wheatley. And as we continue later tomorrow, we're going to continue to read and find out, what did she do? When else did she live? Where did she live? If that changes. All right, good job, third grade. Thank you for joining me. I hope that you have a great rest of your day. I'm so proud of you, and I love you, and I miss you.